In the heart of Egypt, archaeologists have found something inexplicable. Dozens of giant sarcophagi, and not a single body inside. Why did the ancient Egyptians bury the air? Why did they create monuments weighing dozens of tons? For the sake of emptiness? The mystery of the Serapeum calls into question everything we know about death, the soul, and the passage to another world. This is not just archaeology. It's an attempt to touch the mystery that the ancients wanted to leave us, but not to explain. At the heart of Rantimaitsin, ancient Egypt, lies one of the most mysterious archaeological discoveries, the Matkoi Puiks, sarcophagi at Serapeum. This site was discovered in the Palm Fidar Quartusnusti Twin 821st year. At the center is a repository of giant stone sarcophagi, inside of which, strangely enough, there were no bodies. Instead, all that was found in these grandiose tombs was emptiness. But why did the Egyptians bury the air? Why were the empty sarcophagi erected with such attention to detail and such tremendous effort? The question that stirs the minds of archaeologists and historians is this: was it simply a failed project, a mistake, or a sacred rite with important religious or philosophical significance? What lies behind these empty sarcophagi? What significance does this have for understanding ancient Egyptian civilization? To find the answers to these questions, one must go back into the very bonderfitand depths of Egyptian history. Exploring the myths, religious rituals, and archaeological findings that shed light on one of the world's most mysterious places. The Serapeum is the Sankaninchtansias, the sanctuary of the god Osiris, in the ancient Egyptian city of Pananchantagarst, Saqqara. The sanctuary was created about 3,000 years ago, during the Ptolemaic era. There were sacred places to worship the Patutu, Tsuurtitu Bul Apis, who was considered to be an incarnation of the god himself. He was a sacred animal, who was treated with special reverence and worship. After his death, his body was immersed in a sarcophagus and carefully mummified. Apis was essentially a divine animal, an incarnation of the god Pitato, the god of creation and crafts. He was an image of strength and fertility. Apis was so important in Egypt that when he died, solemn rites were organized so that his soul could enter the afterlife, where it would continue to serve as an intermediary between the gods and humans. The process of Doiforge, the burial of Apis was somewhat unusual. He was mummified and placed in a sacred sarcophagus, which was always empty, but was a symbol of this power. After the death of the Apis bull, sarcophagi were placed in a specialized funerary tomb at Serapeum, which were so grandiose that they could not be created without the use of heavy technology and a great deal of labor. When archaeologists began to investigate the Serapeum, they discovered that the sarcophagi that were supposed to be the place for the bodies of Apis' bulls were empty. This immediately spawned a host of theories and questions. Why were the sarcophagi empty? Why would such huge sarcophagi be created if they were never used? Where were the bodies if they were intended to be buried? Initial speculation was that the Chutira Anfand Aide Chuan sarcophagi were intended for the burial of other sacred animals, such as the Apis bulls. But then, for some reason, The bodies were not placed in these sarcophagi. However, the answers to these questions remained vague. What was behind this? One hypothesis is that the emptiness in the sarcophagi had a deep religious meaning. The Egyptians may have seen it as a symbolic release of the soul. Perhaps these sarcophagi were not intended for material bodies, but to be a place for spiritual purification. This explanation is based on ideas about the afterlife in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians believed that after death, the soul of a person or animal had to go through a series of rituals and tests before entering Alvatitu, the divine realm. Perhaps the empty sarcophagi symbolized the process of releasing the spirit from earthly shackles, thus preparing it for eternal life. Ancient Egyptian philosophy of life and death has always been linked to the concept of manifestation of spiritual entities in the physical world, and these sarcophagi may have played a role in this transition. However, the question of why these sarcophagi were empty remains open and requires further study. Another explanation could be the theory that these empty sarcophagi served not for burials, but to conceal something. Some historians hypothesize that these sarcophagi may have once concealed sacred relics. Secret knowledge. There were many hidden teachings in Egypt that were passed down exclusively to the initiated, and these sarcophagi may have been part of such a secret cult. However, the evidence for this theory remains extremely No physical evidence has been found that sarcophagi were used to hide relics. However, this does not preclude such a hypothesis from being true. Another possible explanation is the technical of the issue. The Egyptians may have built these sarcophagi with great effort and using the advanced technology of the time to create a symbolic place for inspiration. Worship. Such grandiose structures may have simply been embodiments of the grandeur of Egyptian society, which sought to create symbols of divine power. Sarcophagi may have been something like monuments, rather than intended for physical burial. But what made the Egyptians build such scale structures without the purpose of burying a body in them? Why did emptiness become an important part of this project? The answers to these questions lie in the symbolism, and tunes, religion of the time. The deeper symbolism associated with empty sarcophagi may lie in the Egyptian concept of eternal life. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but only a mere transition, to another world. They believed that the body and soul must be separated in order for a person to continue to exist in Haritut. Afterlife. However, the question of the Montufit voided in the sarcophagi of the Serapeum poses an important mystery. Why, then, were such grandiose sarcophagi created, if they were not intended for the burial of bodies? Perhaps it was a symbol of transition and liberation from the material world. The emptiness inside the sarcophagi may not have been an accident, but a representation of the spiritual void that is necessary for the soul to be reborn in another world. Void as a metaphor, has been an important element of many cultures. In Egypt, empty space often symbolized not absence, but a willingness to accept and release. For example, the high liberation of the spirit from earthly limitations required precisely seated empty space that would not be defiled by anything earthly. If we consider empty sarcophagi as part of the sarcophagi ritual, we can assume that their illuminated emptiness could symbolize not only transition twice to the afterlife, but also rebirth. Egyptians often used images of death as symbols of renewal. Perhaps the empty sarcophagi at Serapeum symbolized the readiness of the soul to undergo purification and become part of the cosmic order. It is possible that these empty sarcophagi were part of a more complex ritual associated with the absorption of light, or with the the soul of the Apis bull, which was to be freed from the body and continue its existence in the other world. It could be a ritual in which it was not the material form of the body that was important, but rather energy and spiritual purification. The culture of ancient Egypt was extremely complex, multi-layered, and diverse. Egyptian religion intersected various philosophies that had shifted and influenced each other over the centuries. Some rituals, such as funerary practices, may have changed in response to political and religious changes. The influence of different periods on Egyptian funerary traditions should not be underestimated. For example, during the Ptolemaic era, Egypt became part of a wider cultural world that included Greek and Macedonian traditions. This may have influenced new approaches to burial and symbolism. At this time, new rituals may have arisen that were different from those used in older eras, and perhaps empty sarcophagi were associated with a new understanding of death and life. Burial in the void may have been a way of creating a kind of transitional space through which a spiritual entity could transcend to the afterlife. At the same time, the sarcophagi themselves, with their huge size and solid construction, did not represent the body food itself, but the protection of the soul, its connection with the world, and the sacred space. Modern archaeologists who continue to study the Serapeum and other shrines of ancient Egypt have not yet reached a consensus on the true meaning of the empty sarcophagi. However, some studies suggest that they may have been symbols of connection to divine powers. Research has shown that the sarcophagi at Serapeum were not only empty, but also built with precision, indicating high levels of engineering. The stones for the sarcophagi were carefully cut and worked, and the sarcophagi themselves sometimes weighed tens of tons. This begs the question, why did the Egyptians go to such lengths to create such gigantic objects if they were not intended for burial? An important point is the fact that the sarcophagi, despite their emptiness, were carefully fixed in the ground, indicating their particular status. They were not temporary structures, but objects created for specific, possibly cosmic or religious purposes. Many researchers argue that these sarcophagi may have been part of a cosmological ritual that was necessary to establish order in the world. But how can we interpret the emptiness inside these monuments if they were not meant for bodies, but for something more ephemeral, forward? Perhaps the emptiness symbolized not death as the end, but rather the movement of the soul to a higher spiritual level. The hypothesis of the symbolism of the void requires us to further understand the concept of in their religion. Life after death was not just a continuation of earthly existence, but a transition to another world, which was often depicted as a space where spirits, kaiti, and kraukaina, gods, existed in a state of eternal renewal. The emptiness in the sarcophagi may symbolize the nadi, the need for purification and liberation of the soul. This could be related to the philosophy of the Maiti, Solatitilai, not remaining attached to earthly material objects. Thus, the more empty sarcophagi could simply be a metaphor for the ardent transition from the dense material world to a more elevated spiritual reality. The nature of these sarcophagi as symbols of liberation from material shackles is also confirmed by many archaeological finds in other parts of Egypt, where empty spaces in sacred objects played an equally important role in the creation of ritual objects. Thus, the hypothesis of empty sarcophagi as places for the liberation of the soul, or symbols of the spiritual path, becomes one of the most probable. By researching and comparing various ritual practices, it can be concluded that the emptiness inside the sarcophagus represents the idea of our transition, liberation, of the soul from the constraints of the material world. Perhaps all this indicates that the Egyptians buried not the body, but the spirit, which corresponds to their ideas of eternity and rebirth. However, we still have a lot of work to do for a definitive answer, and we may be just on the verge of making big discoveries about the meaning of these wambiti. Sarcophagi. The mystery of the empty sarcophagi at Serapeum has always posed difficult questions for archaeologists. However, based on modern research, it has become clear that the emptiness inside the sarcophagi was not accidental. Archaeologists investigating the Serapeum and other tombs in Egypt have put forward several theories, each of which provides a new perspective on the purpose of these majestic tombs. The first hypothesis, as already mentioned, is related to the symbolism of spiritual purification. However, there is also a technical theory, according to which the sarcophagi may have been designed to hold sacred objects rather than bodies. These empty sarcophagi may have been associated with the ritual of storing worshipful objects that were part of the cult of Teak, the apis, bulls, or other sacred animals. And this space within the sarcophagus may have been intended to symbolically absorb light. Technical details and analysis of the sarcophagus construction itself suggest that such structures could not have been mere burials. Each of these structures represented an incredible effort in terms of work, cost, and resources. Inside the sarcophagi, high-quality stone workmanship was used, and their size and shape do not simply symbolize grandeur, but a functional necessity for storing energy, or spirit. One of the surprising discoveries was that these sarcophagi never contained a Hades, but they were all santinactivated in special places, where the most important religious rites were performed. Such burial practices suggest that the Egyptians may not have used these sarcophagi for physical burial, but rather to create a sacred space that could be temporarily cleansed of the material world, as us to prepare the soul for eternal life. To better understand what the use of empty sarcophagi might have meant in Egypt, It is worth considering similar practices in other cultures. Many ancient civilizations had rituals of purification and Greek symbolic energy absorption, where emptiness played an important role. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, there were funerary practices that involved the burial not of the body, but of symbols and attributes representing the soul. In ancient Greece and Rome, there were also known instances where dead remains could be detached from the soul for the purpose of transition to another world. In these cultures, the most important attributes of the furidu, empty vessels, symbolizing space for the spirit. It is through a comparison of the Egyptian concept of death and the afterlife with other cultures that we can understand that the emptiness in the sarcophagi of the Serapeum was most likely not a mistake or a failed practice, but a conscious act that carried a deep symbolism. The Egyptians may have believed that only empty space, Yarius, could be a place for Paus Chacha eternal life and Fratidensitian spiritual rebirth. A comparison of the empty sarcophagi at Serapeum with other Fuaisher funerary practices in Egypt yields interesting results. There were many burial practices in Egypt that also utilized empty spaces, such as the tombs of the pharaohs and sacral burials. In such burials, the empty space symbolized not only a place for the body, but also a sacred space for the soul. Furthermore, the study of the Serapeum has shown that these sarcophagi may have had a connection to other periods when Egypt was undergoing religious change. During this time, the concept of a sacred emptiness, or Furtertward, was popular, and Egyptians began to use space as a brukidin, means of communicating with the afterlife, where the soul was not confined to the body. Theories about empty sarcophagi become clearer when we consider the importance of symbolism. In Egyptian culture, the Egyptians often used empty vessels and these spaces to emphasize that death was not an end, but a transition into a new existence. Perhaps it was the emptiness in the sarcophagi of the Serapeum that symbolized the release of the soul and its movement into eternity, where the pau material was cut off and the spiritual found freedom. The Egyptians believed in the rebirth of the soul through symbolic purification, and the emptiness in the sarcophagi could mean that the soul had to be freed from the bondu material world in order to be reborn. These sarcophagi may have served as a kind of threshold tours, through which the soul passed into the new world. Interestingly, the symbolism of emptiness also overlaps with concepts that would later be developed in esoteric teachings. For example, in ancient Greek philosophy and mystical teachings, the void was often seen as the primal matter, from which all things arise. In Egypt, this concept may have been adapted to the idea of spiritual purification. Through emptiness, where matter, the body, became immaterial to further existence. Analogies can be drawn here with mystical practices, where the void was seen as a place of transformation. Mystics of different cultures often appealed to the concept of emptiness as the primary basis that allows the soul to go through purification, rebirth, To understand what the practical and spiritual purposes were for creating the empty sarcophagi at the Serapeum, we still have much work to do. However, one thing is already clear. These sarcophagi were not random objects, but part of a much more complex and profound system of beliefs that continue to intrigue us to this day. The study of the empty sarcophagi at Serapeum finds its logical extension in the search for the true meaning of these ancient monuments. Despite many hypotheses and theories, the archaeological findings and philosophy of ancient Egypt certainly give us clues as to why the Egyptians buried air and used empty sarcophagi. These are not just artifacts of antiquity, but symbols of a deep understanding of life, death, and the afterlife. The notion of emptiness as a symbol and means of liberation is key to understanding the Egyptian philosophy of death. The emptiness in these sarcophagi may have been not just a physical space, but a transition, a threshold for the soul to pass through symbolic purification. The Egyptians sincerely believed that, by freeing the soul from material limitations, they gave it a chance for eternal life, for the endless cycle of rebirth, which was an integral part of their religious worldview. It should be emphasized that the idea of liberating the soul from bodily fetters was so deeply woven into Egyptian religion that even the sarcophagi themselves, though intended for bodies, were not inherently as important as the meaning of passage to the afterlife. Thus, the tortufaun diathi siturtatas empty sarcophagi may have been a place for the spirit to be released so that it could continue its existence on a new level of being. What does this emptiness give us today? In our time, the emptiness in the sarcophagi of the Serapeum can be seen not only as a symbol of the ancient rites, but also as an important philosophical sign. It is a reminder that we need to look at life and death in terms of spiritual freedom, not just the material shell. The Egyptians were among the first civilizations to try to conceptualize death as a process of transition rather than the end of existence. The mysteries of the empty sarcophagi remain relevant today. This ancient mystery can help us in our search for the meanings of life, death, and the afterlife that so often remain beyond our understanding. Modern archaeology continues to uncover more and more of the mysteries of ancient Egypt, and each new discovery, whether of a sarcophagus, tomb, or manuscript, helps us to understand more precisely how the ancient Egyptians conceptualized their religious and philosophical systems. The empty sarcophagi at the Serapeum remain one of the most mysterious and unexplored topics. And perhaps only through further research can we get a clearer picture of how the Egyptians used the symbolism of emptiness in their rituals. Interestingly, many modern scholars are beginning to reconsider their views of the afterlife and rituals of ancient Egypt in the context of religious symbols and archaeological findings. Perhaps we don't fully understand the deep connection between the symbols and the actual practices of the time. Advances in archaeology, improved technology, and research methods may lead to new discoveries that will help us solve the latest mystery of the empty sarcophagi. Interestingly, the symbolism of the emptiness in the sarcophagi, from which various theories have developed, has passed into esoteric teachings. In philosophy, emptiness and empty spaces are often interpreted as the beginning of the new Adurthainas, as the place where new forms of existence originate. In Eastern teachings, such as Buddhism or Taoism, emptiness is not an object, but a state in which all things begin to be unified, whole, free from worldliness. The Egyptians, as we see, were already comprehending this principle in ancient times. creating a space for spiritual transition. This understanding of emptiness as the foundation for new being echoes many modern philosophical and spiritual teachings, making the theme of the empty sarcophagi at the Serapeum even more meaningful and relevant. When we analyze the religious and esoteric aspects of the empty sarcophagi, it is worth noting that the mythologization of these objects occurred immediately after their discovery. The sarcophagi of the Serapeum became the subject of numerous hypotheses and theories. They were often perceived as places of secret rituals, symbolizing gates to the other world. In many esoteric teachings, the empty space inside the sarcophagus was seen as a symbol of sacral passage, rather than the absence of anything. In the esoteric tradition, emptiness often symbolizes transition to rebirth and liberation. Interestingly, in different religious and philosophical systems, the idea of emptiness as a place for transition influences our perception of not only death, but also life. How might these concepts affect us today? The mystery of the empty sarcophagi at the Serapeum teaches us that sometimes the deepest mysteries can become not just historical curiosities, but tools for spiritual quest. Tabituridi. These sarcophagi are a reminder that despite the greatness of Egyptian civilization, not everything has been understood and explained. They also remind us that symbols and rituals, even if so mysterious and unexplained, are an important part of culture and spiritual quest. The mystery of the empty sarcophagi at Serapeum is not only a matter of archaeology, but also a philosophy of life and death. The emptiness left by the Egyptians may symbolize transition, liberation, and spiritual renewal. These sarcophagi, while not a place for bodies, became symbols of a Mabari's spiritual journey that transcends physical death. Today, as we revisit these ancient monuments, we must remember that their meaning goes far beyond material things. The emptiness in the sarcophagi of the Serapeum may be the Bwarho Ku Hard to understanding the deeper aspects of the human soul and its quest for eternity. And it is possible that this mystery will remain with us for many years to come, prompting us to seek answers that connect the past Yudus and Shuat present to the material and the Miachuan spiritual. These empty sarcophagi at the Serapeum remind us that the true strength of ancient civilizations is not only in their material achievements, but in the way they attempted to understand Shitiu and Shititin and transmit Kaitiponinf ideas that may never have been fully discovered. Thank you for watching to the end. Share this video and write in the comments. What do you think about empty sarcophagi? Why do you think the Egyptians left these monumental structures empty? How does this affect our understanding of life and death?